Hello. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this event, which is going to be a conversation between Marc Angélil, myself, Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, and Nicolas Memain, discussing our newest publication, Migrant Marseille, Architectures of Social Segregation and Urban Inclusivity, co-edited with Something Fantastic and published with Ruby Press this past winter. So I will first introduce everyone, including myself. Marc Angélil is a practicing architect and urban designer at AGPS Architecture, a firm with ateliers in Los Angeles and Zurich. He holds the 2021 Kenzo Tange Visiting Professorship in Architecture and Urban Planning and Design at Harvard University and is Professor Emeritus from ETH Zurich, conducting research on social and spatial developments of metropolitan regions worldwide. His most recent publication, Mirroring Effects, Tales of Territory, was co-written with Carrie Cyrus, exploring the socio-spatial impact of development-led urbanization on local habitats in different world regions today. His installation at the 2021 Venice Architecture Biennale in the Cohabitat section of the exhibition, How Will We Live Together, addresses the hybrid economic and political forces at work in the production of Addis Ababa's urban fabric, foregrounding prevalent conflicts of coexistence while exploring alternative ways of how Addis Ababa might live together in the future. Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, so myself, I'm an architect, urban designer, and assistant professor of urban design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. My teaching and research interests are related to how design disciplines can critically engage with issues of resources, the mainstream economy, governance, and ecological and social justice. Principal of the urban design agency Omnibus, I hold a PhD from ETH Zurich on the effects of the political economy of commodities on the built environment, and I was program director of the Master of Advanced Studies in Urban Design at the chair of Marc Angélil, focused on informal housing, migration, and inclusivity in Mediterranean city, co-publishing Housing Cairo, The Informal Response, and Migrant Marseille, which we will talk about today. I'm also a founding member of the Parity Group and Parity Front, activist networks dedicated to improving gender equality and equity in architecture. Our third guest is Nicolas Memain. He's an urbanist without a diploma. He's a member of the Cercle des Marcheurs and cartographer of the GR 2013. He received the prize of urban planning of the French Academy of Architecture for the creation of a metropolitan path. As a specialist in urban planning and architecture of the 20th century, he organizes architectural walks in several municipalities around Marseille and participated in an architectural inventory for heritage and preservation. In 2020, he was also elected municipal councillor of the 1st district of Marseille. Now, before we dive in, first, let's say a quick reminder about some features you'll see in this Zoom webinar. Marc and I will respond to questions during today's event, so feel free to submit these into the queue at any time by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have live captioning available for this event. Click the closed caption button at the bottom of your window to turn them on. Before we begin, I want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. This Thursday, April 1st at 12, join us for our Rose Visiting Artists lecture with Zoe Leonard, who will present a work in progress titled Al Rio to the River in conversation with curator José Esparza Chonkoy. On Monday, April 5th at 12, join us for a conversation on small town urbanism with Andrew Freer, Faranak Miraftab, and Todd Okolichani, moderated by GSD faculty members Yves Blau and Diane Davis. All these lectures will happen on Zoom and require registration, and there will be more information available to register on the GSD website. Now, for today's event, it is supported by the Professor Bill Breger MArch 45 Fund in honor of Professor Walter Gropius, fund which was established in 2014 in celebration of the GSD's 75th anniversary and Professor Bill Breger's 19th birthday. The fund honors the legacy of architect Walter Gropius, Professor Breger's professors and valued employers, and aims to perpetuate Gropius' philosophy and practice in the cognitive life of the Graduate School of Design. The Breger Fund is used to support teaching and research at the GSD that holds similar objectives to those of Dr. Gropius, including the social utility of architecture. Most recently, it has been used to provide financial aid for GSD students in the Master of Architecture program. So with no further delay, I would ask Nicola to switch on his camera, and we'll be starting by his account of Marseille and the current situation, or perhaps a little bit of both, and how we've also engaged in the work that is discussed today. I will be sharing some slides to accompany Nicola's talk. So Nicolas, c'est à toi.
So thanks for having me. Just a presentation about Marseille's situation. It's a really singular city in Europe because the city center is inhabited by the poorest of the citizens of the city. It's an historic situation. It was due mainly because of plagues and the epidemic of cholera in the 19th century. And so the wealthiest inhabitant of Marseille never wanted to live in the city center. And in the last years, the public policies were not able helping this situation. In the suburbs built during the 20th century, the public policy, what is named National Urban Renewal Plan, scheduled to demolish partly the social housing built during the 60s and 70s. So it did stress the housing market. And in the city center, the only public policy was to help private investors if they invest their money in refurbishing apartments, and if they promise to rent those apartments, then they will pay less taxes. And because of those two inefficient public policies, the situation of my cities did decay during the two last decades. What did happen lastly is that trying to solve those problems, the only public action available was to invest in urban requalification, what means here to renew the urban ground in the historic city center. It did happen after 2014. It was the possibility for the public institution to grow debt, to do loans for those urban operations. Because of a new administrative situation, we have a large new urban metropolitan area. And because of this new metropolitan area, they can grow new debt. This money was really important because the main trouble that did appear in 2014 was that a large shopping center did open in the city center. And so all the shops in the former building, in the historic buildings, on the ground floor of the historic building, most of those shops, let's say 1/3 of those shops, did meet bankruptcy, did fail economically, and most of half of them saw their benefits decay, growing down. So because of this, the public policy decided to renew the ground, to do luxurious ground floor with limestone pavement in the purpose of doing a better city center, a nicer city center, with a main goal of attracting international tourism to renew it. But it wasn't efficient enough. In 2016, they did decide to renew the largest square of the city center, which is named La Plaine, La Place Jean Jaurès Square. And it wasn't such a good idea because in this district, we had two main economies competing together. We have the residential economy. It means that this large square, it was a market, and it was a really noisy market, so it was really hard to live there. And because this market did live 40 years ago, in the city center, you have owner of beautiful apartments, and they want to live there, and they want to enjoy their belongings. And meanwhile, you have another economy, which is the night economy, which is the economy of bar, cafe, music, disco. And so you have a lot of artists too. And so it was the district of Marseille with the best example known of social mixity. And so 4 years ago, they decided to renew this large square. And to do so, they tried to ask for the participation of the citizens. And those experiments of participation never succeeded. The inhabitants of the district always complained about this project. Nobody wanted this project, but this project had been forced to us. The construction of it began in 2018, in October 2018, and it did begin by cutting 63 on the square, and this did transform the protestation in social riots. And so we had social riots with, let's say, 10 policemen per tree to allow contractors to cut the tree, and hundreds of citizens going on the square and trying to oppose to the cutting of the tree. Because of this really tense situation, the city council decided to build a temporary wall around the square of 2.5 meters high to protect the construction. And while they were beginning to construct this wall, you can see the wall on the picture. On the second day of the construction of this wall, on the 5th of November 2018, 200 meters from the square, a main accident happened. We had two old buildings that did collapse by themselves on the 63 and 65 Rue d'Aubagne. Those were really old buildings from the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, just in the historic center. And one of those two buildings was empty and belonging to the city. And there is an inquiry about this accident, but most of the clues are indicating that the collapse did happen because the building owned by the city wasn't managed to stand. It had a lake of roof, and it had inundated caves. Because of this accident, 8 citizens died, and it was a really large emotion. First, you have those urban riots against a urban renewal operation, and suddenly you have this drama, and it changed completely the mentality, the way of thinking of the citizen of Marseille. We felt like abandoned by the public institution. After this, a large paranoia, a collective paranoia did cross my city and the mind of my citizens. Everybody was feared about the collapse of other buildings. Now we are 1.5 years after, 2.5 years after, and during those 2 years, we had 500 buildings that had been abandoned because they may fell down, 2,000 households that were forced to move in new settlements, and for most of them, temporarily staying in hotels with no kitchen, with no comfort. And so those 2,000 households, it's a bit less than 5,000 citizens that were forced to move. It's like an earthquake. It's like a natural catastrophe. After this, in 2020, it did happen les élections municipales, city council election, and the last majority did fail, and now we have a new majority, but it's a really complex situation because the city council did change, but the metropolitan area didn't change, and after 2018, the ability to fix the housing issues had been given to the metropolitan area. So we did vote to change the situation, but because of a kind of democratic trap or administrative trap, those are the same individuals leading the housing issue before and after the 2018 event. It's a really dramatic situation. We are a Mediterranean city, so we think it's like the antique Greek drama. And we live like that. The city council, I'm a part of it, trying to fix the situation, but it's really hard. We are between citizens which are really bored of the lack of efficiency of the public policies, and the opposition in the metropolitan area, which is kidding about us and which refuse to discuss with us and refuse to allow us what is necessary to fix the housing issue. In this drama, there is a little bit of optimism. It did happen lastly. I did meet a young photographer. He's 33 years old. And is really seduced by a urban situation in the outskirts of Marseille, which is named Parc Caliste. Parc Caliste is the name of a really big housing estate. It's a private housing condominium built in the early 60s. And those are the most important issue in my city, more than the historic center, is the situation of several big private condominiums around the city, which are like in a total bankruptcy. Elevators doesn't work. Collecting garbage doesn't work. They are inhabited by the poorest of the Marseille citizens, and they live there because you have a few owners. Each owner has several flats, several dwellings, and those big owners, they expect only the public subsidy to pay the rent, because in France you have a part of the rent, if you're really poor, that can be paid by public subsidy. And so this system we call CAFistes. CAF is the name of the public institution to pay rent with public money. Les CAFistes, it did change completely the housing market, and we have this really singular housing market. We say it's like formerly the wealthiest Marseille citizens, they were pressing olive to do oil, and now they do press poor citizens. They crush them, they crush poor citizens, not to do oil, but to do money with this strange housing situation. And so just 1 week ago, I met a young photographer, totally desperate and bored like me by this situation. And we were discussing, we were meeting for the first time, discussing about this situation. He shared with me his lack of optimism about this, and because in the last 2 months, two big buildings of this private housing estate, which is Parc Caliste, two of the biggest buildings just had been demolished by public action. It's something like 200 dwellings that had been demolished. And we need apartments. I told you we have 5,000 citizens that were forced to move. So the prices are staying really high on the renting market because of this, because we have a lack of apartments on the market. And completely bored by this, I show him the book, Migrant Marseille. And I show him the work of the student of ETH Zurich, work inspired by Lacaton and Vassal architects, with a system named Plus. And it was a proposal, instead of demolishing building, to let them grow and to double them with a new facade to extend the size of each apartment, for each apartment to be more comfortable, and for all those apartments being able, guesting new citizens, wealthier citizens, and recreate a situation of social mixity in Parc Calisté. But the French public policies were to demolish those buildings and to keep the poorest. For this young photographer, learning the project of the student of Zurich, it was amazing for him. It was a bubble of optimism. It was a bubble of collective intelligence, of intelligence of the project, and we are not used to such an intelligence in the urban management in Marseille, and that's why I think that this book is really important for my city, is because we are not used to clever projects. We are used to inefficient public policies and despising each other. What do you think about Charlotte?
I love your account of that. I think that's wonderful. And maybe before we let you go, because you can only be with us for that short time, and thank you for giving your kind of your account of the situation in Marseille and the situation in the city. Could you maybe say how the situation has evolved a little bit or not in the past year, since we have seen that the municipality has changed? Is there any, I mean, we talked about how the let's say the public agencies have, favored the demolition as a policy instead of, maintaining or refurbishing or even building new. It seems like demolition is really more, a policy. There are various reasons for that. Do you want to maybe develop a little bit on this and what is the new situation?
We don't know about those demolition. What is hidden behind is that when you do a demolition, you don't have to buy the ground. And the ground is really expensive, and so contractors constructing new buildings are really scared about the price of the ground. And by demolishing building, they can be sure not to pay the ground, because the ground is already here. And they can be sure that the market will stay high, and that they can sell the new buildings with a really high price. High price in Marseille, it's 2,500 euros per square meters for a new building, for housing. And building new apartments may be the situation, but we decided that the city will not grow in size, because we have only a little bit of countryside left, because we cannot pay for the water pipes, for the collective transportation system, and so we have to keep the size of the city, and the city needs to renew on itself. And in this situation, it's really hard to build new apartments, to give new to let the city grow on the same size on the ground and to grow vertically. It's really hard for the city to grow like that. So we have some investors. They are really scared about the situation. They are really scared by the new city council, because the new city council, it's crazy leftist. They don't trust us, and we have ecologists in the city council. So we ask for quality and for ecological quality in the new council. But the main issue, the main trouble, is the inefficiency of the administrative situation. I mean, it's really complex. Marseille is a large city with its own city council. It has 800,000 inhabitants. It's a really large city, but it's a part of a metropolitan area of 1,800,000 inhabitants. And so Marseille is less than half of the metropolitan area. And we gave the public tools to fix the housing situation. We gave it in 2019 to the metropolitan area, arguing that it was for a better efficiency, that the metropolitan area will be more efficient. It appears that the people leading the metropolitan area, they don't want to fix the problem. Why? I don't know. It's like a black novel. It's a tragedy. It did appear that some, not a lot, but some of the owners of shitty buildings, of really poor housing situation, some of the owners were elected on the right side in the city council or in the metropolitan area. Some of them were specialized in those issues of regulation of poor housing situation and how to make money with public subsidy like that. So in a way, it appears that because of political opposition, they don't want to help us. They want the situation to go worse, to be more and more bad. Nowadays, a new public institution did appear. It's named SPLIN. It's really complex. I think it will begin with something like 40 million euros to renew the city center, one building after another, and after new money will come from the government. This money is only to create new loan, to help investors to refurbish old buildings. And it did happen the last week. This new public institution is like an empty shell. It doesn't want to work neither. It's unable to spend money. It's unable to invest. And so let's say that nowadays, I just live the tragedy. I'm just like reading the old Odyssey from Homer.
Okay, Nicola, there is a question about the role of the EU in housing policies. So, and the question is from Sandra Rishani, and she asks, how does EU policy target second-generation refugees? So probably the first part of the question would be first-generation refugees and then second-generation refugees.
I'm really not aware about this situation, about European policies, about the migrants and the refugees. What I know is that to have the public, to have the European funds, you need some skills. You need some really particular skills. And the individuals with such skills, we don't have them. We don't have the individuals able asking for European funds to help us. And so we need to hire them from other cities. But the political situation is so complex that all the political levels are in a state of bankruptcy. The city of Marseille cannot invest. The metropolitan area cannot invest. The county cannot invest. It's because we spend so much money in inefficient public operation, like we did build the tramway system above the metro, or we are doing those ground renewal in the historic center. And those investments are not efficient to bring back money to get new inhabitants of Marseille that may pay tax. And so by paying tax, allowing those administration to invest once again. So I'm sorry, I'm not aware about
no, but you
European fund for migrants, for refugees, pardon.
You answered the question, because that's exactly the problem that you encounter in many European countries. Although EU members have signed an agreement, a basic based on the basic principle of immigrant integration. So there is agreement about that the immigrants have to be integrated. However, most countries have a lack of housing and cannot establish, this foundation in order to integrate people. And we are talking here about the first generation of refugees, and the second generation, that's then another issue.
But Nicola, maybe I know that you have to leave, but there was one question, and I think it's also perhaps a good way to conclude and also to loop to the content of the publication and the book. A question by Marc Angélil, who was asking, where do the poor live in general? Is it in the large-scale low-income housing projects in the suburbs, or in the city center buildings without maintenance? He's asking, what are the tendencies? Where do people move when they are squeezed out from both center and suburbs?
So it's a really good question, and Marseille is really singular. Most of the European cities did refurbish their historic centers, their inner city center. And so most of the inner city of big European cities are inhabited by wealthy citizens. The Marseille situation is singular. We didn't refurbish enough the historic city center, and the historic city center stay a little bit ill-famed. Ill-famed because it's noisy, it stinks, and we are a society divided by racism. And Marseille is a city full of immigrants, always renewing itself with new migrants arriving, mostly second half of the 20th century, Arabic people from the former French colonies. And so the wealthiest citizens, they live in the outskirts of Marseille, and mostly in the south. If Paris is divided west and east for the richest and the poorest, Marseille is divided north and south. The wealthiest inhabitants of Marseille are in the south. They do avoid the city center. Gentrification didn't work in the 80s and in the 90s. Even it's really strange. Gentrification did transform former villages around Marseille, but not the center of Marseille. And the north of Marseille and the center of Marseille is inhabited by the poorest. What do appear nowadays is that the former team leading Marseille, the former team that did lose the last election, they had a secret goal. A hidden goal of them was to demolish the city center. So because they wanted this, they let the building, they let the situation rotten. They never helped to refurbish apartments, to renew buildings, to renew blocks, to renew streets, because if you let the situation rotten, finally, we will be forced to demolish it. And it did appear, honestly, with the collapsing of the building Rue d'Aubagne, that in a way it was their goal. So the social situation of Marseille is really singular. Some geographers, they say it's like Napoli in Italy. Poorest people live in the center. And because those are old buildings, and those buildings are less comfortable than the new building in the outskirts, so it's a stable situation to keep the poorest in the center.
So before you leave, Nicola, because we know you have a big event tonight, there is one more question that you might be able to answer from Pascal Menoret, and he writes, "Salut Nicolas," so he knows you probably. What methodology do we have? So what methodologies do we have to measure racial segregation?
So French situation, yeah, we are not allowed, by the French constitution, we are not allowed to speak about the color of the skin. We are not allowed to speak about the religion. And so by the constitution of the French Republic, we are not allowed to do sociology about migrants, where they are from, and religion. And so we don't have the tools to do so.
Thank you, Nicola. I think we're going to set you free. Thank you so much for your participation, and of course being our friend and partner on this project. We will talk more about the book and the work to which you are part with the Bureau des Guides, and hopefully help to answer the question. And thank you so much for your vivid account and all these insights on the city. Thank you, Nicola.
Au revoir, Nicolas.
Au plaisir de vous revoir. Nice to see you again.
Bientôt.
Goodbye.
So I'm going to basically pick it up from here. These are big shoes to fill, of course, with Nicola's, after Nicola's presentation. I'm hoping to be sharing what I want to share. So basically, Nicola made a really great introduction into what was the situation in Marseille, and he allowed us to locate the work somehow into larger questions. I think what we were trying to show, he was also addressing. He talked about the kind of challenges that that we will be discussing in the book also, and in the presentation, questions of migration, public housing, and building maintenance, and also perhaps taking this a little bit more into the terrain of urban design. How can design disciplines respond to these contemporary challenges, addressing migration, public housing, and building maintenance? And how can design discipline be also propositional, using the tools available to us, and to offer these new, possibly new responses to counter the economic forces that generate increased poverty, while offering a somehow constructive critique of bad governance that Nicola was already mentioning, while all advocating for equity. So the bulk of the research and design work that was done in Marseille, that was already started to be discussed, was conducted in the frame of the Master of Advanced Studies in Urban Design at ETH Zurich, at the chair of Marc Angélil, master that was directed by myself. And then it is maybe perhaps important to mention that Marseille is also my hometown. So as Nicola was mentioning, on the 5th 2018, two buildings, one of them public property, collapsed in the area of Noailles, which is a popular and central area with a building stock from the 18th century, more or less maintained. The New York Times dedicated to the drama a long article calling Marseille the French Detroit, and highlighting bad governance for the lack of housing stock maintenance. The title was actually changed afterwards. Perhaps Detroit complained. In this tragedy, 8 people lost their lives, as Nicola mentioned, people that were coming from various places: Algeria, the Comoros, France, Italy, and Tunisia. And it's been 2 years, in fact. And as addressed by this local newspaper, La Marseillaise, 2 years after, the slum issue remains unaddressed, as the neighborhood was actually holding a commemorative ceremony. So this devastating toll of urban decay also reflects perhaps both the diversity of the district and the hardship of living in Marseille, a harbor city marked by migration and social struggles. It's a city that is settled between the sea and the mountainous region of l'Étoile. It's a territory that's very marked by topography and hydrography, a social and economic landscape with this combination of what you see here, a kind of a terroir, a productive hinterland, and the city, le port, la rade. So Marseille is a harbor city, a city harbor with a perceived proximity to the African continent, from where it drew commodities for all its industrial economy via colonial activities. And as a trading port, constant flows of people and goods have shaped the physical, social, and economic geography, in particular these successive waves of migration of the past century. So as the harbor expands north of the city with its industrial enterprises, with soap, sugar, and tile factories, this economic boom also fuels migrant labor around 1830 to 1914, with Italian, Spaniard, Corsicans, and also forced migration from the colonies, population who settled in the northern peripheral areas of the city. So on the opposite side, as Nicola was mentioning, the bourgeoisie established itself, and here you already have this kind of dichotomy between the north and the south establishing itself. So from then on, the migratory growth was continuous. After 1918, Russians fleeing the October Revolution, Armenians escaping genocide, Spaniards leaving Franco's dictatorship, and then post-World War II, employment migration from colonized North African countries, and around 1960 with the post-colonial migration with thousands of Pieds Noirs, the French colons, leaving independent Tunisia and Algeria, along with the Arquis, the Algerian natives who had fought for France or were forced to fight for France, and with the last and somewhat ongoing wave from the 1970s onward, hailing from Comoros, Africa, and more recently Syria. And there is an urban counterpart to this migration history. What you see in the middle is the harbor, and then the dichotomy between the north and the south, with here, as France was experiencing housing shortages, no homes were constructed for all these incoming laborers and their family who clustered in simple provisional housing and transit camps or overcrowded self-built bidonville here again on the north. So these northern neighborhoods where the harbor was or is already home to the industries, to the working class, to precarious migrant workers and their family, also saw the construction of 90% of the city's social housing projects, now called zones sensibles, which you see again with these overlaps of map, difficult areas. That's what translates. Zones sensibles. So these modernist estates, grands ensembles, located north of the city, were first populated and intended for French lower-class citizens who, as soon as they gained financial stability and accessed home ownership, vacated the blocks, with migrants moving into this long-coveted HLM, habitation à loyer modéré, so cheap rent, like Parc Alisté, which we discussed already and that you see here on this picture. Or La Castellane or Félix Piat. Here you see a few of these blocks on these typological studies of grands ensembles. And so along with Euro-Méditerranée, here the dot that you see here, there was contentious sites in a way for which we have developed urban design schemes that I will discuss later. You have Félix Piat, which is a cité, home to a homogeneous community with residents overwhelmingly from Comoros. It's a degraded co-ownership. That means that the maintenance costs charged to flat owners are prohibitive, sometimes as much as 400 euros per month on top of the rent, while the most basic services are no longer provided. And this is because the co-ownership has accumulated debt and cannot pay for the suppliers and providers. The owners understandably refuse to pay, and the co-ownership debt rises exponentially. Now, the state response has been via the National Agency for Urban Renewal, l'ANRU, to rely on demolitions. Authorities argue that this mechanism can change the image of these neighborhoods. In practice, it allows for better police access and increased policing while sending a critical message to the current occupants. Ecology of Deconstruction is an urban design project for Félix Piat, which taps on the 300,000 cubic meter of waste that will be produced by the neighboring Euro-Méditerranée urban development scheme, which I will talk about quickly after that, which is one of the largest in Europe. It proposes, so this project now here, proposes an alternative urban economy to create jobs for low-skilled workers ignored by official labor markets, and urban development project in Marseille. Taking advantage of the site's central location and abundance of open space and answering to the high unemployment rate of 80%, the scheme is a manufacturing platform at the foot of the towers for the reuse, repair, and upcycling of materials from building deconstruction. It's an industrial cooperative that leases to medium, small, and micro enterprises with the public part with Portsfield Place over the space of production. So dealing with waste materials, it offers a contextual, climate-aware, ethical, social, urban design reactive to an unjust situation. Now, Euro-Méditerranée. Euro-Méditerranée is a massive urban renewal scheme initiated in 1995, located in the northern district of Marseille along the industrial harbor. It's a government initiative, une opération d'intérêt national, which can resort to legal mechanisms such as expropriation, even though out of the 7 billion euros in investment, 5 billion are from private sources. So what you see here on the foreground is the self-proclaimed Mediterranean eco-friendly district of the future. the second phase of the project. What you see in the background is the first phase with the 2 towers from Zaha Hadid Architects and Jean Nouvel. But the second phase that you see here is the realized project Marseille, a 14-hectare development amidst which sits Marseille's flea market. Currently, it's an area that functions very much as an arrival neighborhood. There is a primary housing shelter for immigrants, immediate job opportunities at the market and the port, and cheap food and goods. The Euromed project will affect the old factories that you see on the left, and this kind of working class neighborhood around the flea market, such as the village of La Cabucelle, which was first inhabited by Italians, then Armenians, and most recently, sub-Saharan African migrants. So here again, tabula rasa is policy. What you see, everything in black, should be making way for a new big development, which will displace some 5,000 impoverished working class residents to usher in some 30,000 new residents of a higher social status. So this urban renewal method that destroy a historically active industrial district and an arrival neighborhood points at the social exclusion of local inhabitants and of poor newcomers, exposing this population to an uncertain future. The project Port of Entry objects to the current modus operandi of development and to this kind of instant urbanism done without the inhabitants by drafting a counter model, incremental and participative, planning a diversity of social classes, density, and building types. It also starts by a critical reading of Euro-Mediterranean's principle here on the left. So the proposed scheme regulates speculation by targeting different categories of developers, from cooperative to the state to private companies, and preserves existing buildings to accommodate affordable housing, manufacturing, commercial activities, and public space. It argues that the site next to the Marché aux Puces already offers everything that makes Marseille an arrival and inclusive city, housing for migrants, informal jobs at the market and the port, and cheap necessary products. So capitalizing on these existing conditions, the project injects new working space and affordable housing. The scheme does not detract developer, but instead phases the development of the area over time to empower residents and newcomers in order to preserve existing qualities for people to arrive, settle, and stay. Noailles, we've mentioned already, the area that has been suffering from this kind of collapse situation. It is an area where you can find the kind of urban inclusivity that we talked about, because it's offering also cheap housing and it's home to humble populations. Yet after the drama of 2018, the area remains damaged. And in 2015, a report had listed some 40,000 apartments across the city as potentially dangerous, some 100,000 people at risk. An assessment that was followed by little official action, I think something that Nicola was already mentioning. The shortcomings of the municipality, which blamed the tragedy on rain rather than mismanagement, triggered a wave of demonstrations calling for the mayor's removal and an end to unsafe housing. The panicked reaction of the authorities was to pronounce many of these buildings uninhabitable via the process of arrêté de péril, what you see here on this image, which basically means that inhabitants have an hour to pack their things and leave the building, which is then closed. And that there was a kind of large-scale evacuation of the residents of this neighborhood. The structures that fell are a kind of famous local typology, Trois Fenêtres, and the tragic event indicated poor maintenance. There were adjacent buildings that were purchased by the municipality, and some have been already demolished. So no satisfying solution was provided, with some inhabitants staying in hotels until today. I think there are still a few people waiting decent relocation, and small owners forced to sell their flats at times because they were unable to pay for renovation costs, and so on. So you have local groups which are demanding a transparent, inclusive plan and decent rehousing rather than top-down profit-driven scheme that looms when Nicola was talking about the previous municipality desire to let the city center rot to make some new development project. So the project Noailles Calling promotes the value of rehabilitation and of maintenance by deploying an existing legal model, the Association Syndicale Libre. It's a kind of co-ownership organization that can bring together all co-ownership unions, the syndicats de copropriété, which are usually managing buildings, by pooling the capital of all these unions and thus offering guarantees to banks for accessing loans. The ASL can buy and commonly own property from a full block to a single apartment. It's a scheme that is usually used to own and manage parking spaces as a common good for the co-ownership. So with this money, the ASL can operate at several scales, renovating the trois fenêtres typology, reconstructing properties under this arrêté de péril, this procedure I mentioned earlier, or rent apartments to former owners and evicted residents and revive ground floor and courtyard. So in short, it's a legal model that provides a tool to renovate the existing stock without gentrifying Noailles. These projects, along with 5 others, were exhibited last year in Marseille under the title 8 questions sur des sujets urbains, 8 questions on urban matters. The exhibition took place in a space that is always open to the public in the center of the city at our partner space, le Bureau des Guides, of which Nicola is also a member. And that helped us to build a kind of situated knowledge as the Bureau des Guides is locally grounded and they use walking as a critical practice. So they were extremely instrumental to this work. The work exhibited in their spaces were mostly asking questions and giving some answers and trying to visually communicate these, suggesting, for instance, these cooperative models, but also asking whether a city is made in a day and pointing at the fact that the most sustainable act is perhaps to maintain what exists. The catalog is available in French on the site of our local partners. If you're fast enough, you can snap the QR code and that will take you there. The questions that were formulated in this exhibition work toward increasing somehow the relevance of planning discipline, articulated around making urban and territorial design public knowledge, and something that is also formulated tacitly in the publication to foster a planned urban inclusivity with principles that are proposed as codes to design, legal tools that reference existing mechanisms that can support social and spatial inclusivity, and ideas that are compiled in a kind of sort of hands-on manual of prescriptive examples for inclusive qualities. So the idea is to offer an array of perspectives to design cities and neighborhoods that combat social segregation and aim for urban inclusivity. So here are a few. They're like anti-zoning, proposition for higher diversity, lease structure for ownership, car-free ground floor, diverse plot sizes to counter monosocial and economic ownership and uses, double height in interiors to allow flexible appropriation, injecting low-rise building around existing huge high-rise slabs to create urbanity, like the project in Caliste that Nicola was discussing, co-working courtyards, detached plots, real estate variety, and differential use in time as some of the 100 ideas, principles, and tools to be found in the publication. So you will find in this book basically compiled along the research and project that were discussed here. There will be specific points that we would like to discuss, and I will pass it on to Marc, but I think very clearly questions of housing maintenance, migration, the role of urban form, and what we mean by the term urban inclusivity as something that is working against social segregation, somehow also with this idea that we're aiming at making planning a matter of public interest, and how planners can take an active role into that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen to let Marc jump in.
Charlotte, it's always such a great pleasure to listen to you. I could listen for hours. Thank you for your presentation, and also a big thank you to Raoul Meotra for having initiated this event. Raoul, we wish you a fast recovery, and in case you are listening, and probably you are listening, we will try to not make you laugh, as this could be rather physically painful. So we got, in the meantime, a few questions from our dean, from Sarah Whiting, that I will try to answer and incorporate in my very brief presentation. But before starting, I thought I would show my first collaboration with Charlotte Malterre-Barthes. This was 2008 at the Venice Architecture Biennale. We were in the Swiss pavilion, and you see here Charlotte as a very young urban designer, together with her future office partner, Noburo Kawagishi. They formed the enterprise Omnibus. And what was very interesting about this collaboration was that Charlotte proposed a Trojan horse strategy for Addis Ababa at the time that we showed in the exhibition. And maybe we could address this notion of urban design as a Trojan horse later on in the discussion. So what I would like to briefly do in order to address Sarah Whiting's question is to situate the book Migrant Marseille that you see on the far right in the broader framework of a research initiative launched approximately 15 years ago at ETH Zurich. And the book, Migrant Marseille, is the most recent publication in a series of books addressing alternative approaches to urbanization processes in various contexts, including such cities as Addis Ababa in 2010, popular settlements in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, 2014, a book on the Minha Casa Minha Vida housing project in Brazil, and then in 2016, another publication on informal housing in Cairo, and most recently, now returning to Europe by way of Marseille through Europe's back door, so to speak. So the series was initiated as a response to the prevalent Eurocentric approach to urban design promoted at our school in Zurich at the time. And in collaboration with students and the junior faculty in particular, we redesigned the teaching curriculum, which also led to a reorientation of research agendas at the institutes, foregrounding such issues as rural and urban poverty, social segregation, the stigmatization and marginalization of population, transnational migration, and what all this could mean for urban design. And so we created a new course, a one-year design course, and Charlotte was in charge of this endeavor. The books have in general a three-part structure, ranging from theoretical observation, here shown in the left, which are addressed in lectures and seminar formats, to urban design proposal, and you have seen some of them in Charlotte's presentation. So this is with the work done in the studio, based also on visits to Marseille. And finally, to the formulation together with the students and the junior faculty of planning guidelines done by the research team and compiled by the research team at the Institute. In each case, and this is rather important, we made sure to collaborate with stakeholders in situ, universities, civil society organization, governmental agencies, which most often helped us to question our own preconceptions about local socio-spatial practices. And we always had preconceptions. So the next slide involved the translation of the findings into practice. So this takes me now far away from Marseille, but what was done normally after these research and design research undertakings. So this was done at three levels. First, at the local level, again, with the support of local partners via, for example, the formation of multifunctional cooperatives in rural towns in Ethiopia, via the organization of participatory meetings with citizens in Brazil, or via the initiation of debates with resident stakeholders concerning the future of informal neighborhoods in Egypt. So all this happened after the work was done in the studio. It also became clear that bottom-up approaches necessitated top-down support at the national level if changes to the status quo were to be implemented. So for instance, a meeting with a state-led cooperative association in Ethiopia on the far left, or with the National Housing Secretary that you see here of Brazil in Brasilia, or an exhibition organized by the Egyptian, for the Egyptian Minister of Urban Renewal in Formal Settlements, Laila Iskandar, that you see in the slide, just a few months before the ministry was dismantled by the LCC regime. And the next slides, and lastly, at the level of global governments, we engaged in discussions on how to shape urban policies within the framework of intergovernmental institutions. For example, by an exhibition at the United Nations in New York, participation at the UN Habitat Forum in Medellin, Colombia, or the organization of workshops at the annual meeting of the International Cooperative Alliance in Kuala Lumpur, shown on the very far right in Malaysia. All this to raise awareness of particular urban challenges for policy makers. All in all, the responses to our forays in the real work varied significantly. At times we were received with open arms, such as in the case of our work in Brazil, which was supported by the national press. Here, a full-page article in O Globo, Brazil's equivalent of the New York Times, which in turn opened doors to the Ministry of Housing in Brasilia, which subsequently led to collaborations with local communities, contacts with housing activists across the country, and so forth. Occasionally, our work was also controversially received, to put it mildly, particularly when we dared to critically question official positions or narratives, when uncovering unethical practices on the ground, or when highlighting particular blind spots at the state level. Our book on Cairo's informal housing districts, for example, was held up at the customs office by the Egyptian Security Authority because it showed maps of popular neighborhoods that in the state imaginary did not and still do not exist, though these settlements are de facto there and house over 60% of Cairo's populations. These pages had to be removed. And with the banning of the book, obviously the book was sold out within a few months. So to conclude, wherever we went, a particular notion of development-led or capital-led urbanization was being promoted by the elites in power, whether in Mumbai, Khartoum, Rio, Shanghai, or in Marseille, driven by what Raoul Meotra calls impatient capital, and all propagating a particular kind of world-class city model based on grand projet design. The image here in the slide is the celebrated Euro-Méditerranée venture that Charlotte mentioned. Such projects are capital intensive, most often relying on public funding for infrastructure provisions. They are socially segregated, they are class specific and exclusive, and asocial vis-à-vis the public at large. They are contextually indifferent and based on blueprint spatial constellations. They are locked in with specific technologies, materially wasteful and carbon heavy, while giving lip service to sustainable measures. And they are procedurally opaque and buttressed by political and economic elites, facilitating their realization. And in saying no to all this, we argued for giving local populations a voice and to empower them in all matters concerning the production of their habitats, and this became the mantra of the design courses. In so doing, we disagreed with status quo understandings of urban design, status quo understandings that were being taught at the school, and began to promote instead a fundamentally different agenda of what urban design can do and must do, namely to nurture socio-spatial inclusivity, equity, and diversity, with urban design as the platform for negotiation, for negotiating planning guidelines and design propositions in view of their potential realization. So let me conclude with a few remarks on the French flag that you see here on the cover, the tricolore, which stands for liberty, blue, equality, white, and fraternity, red. So bleu, blanc, rouge. Our book suggests increasing the amount of white, insofar as equality must regain its importance in whatever we do.
Thanks, Marc. Great, great way to contextualize this work. I mean, I would suggest we would maybe answer the questions or some of the questions. There are many that we have in the chat, and then we can perhaps address some of the points that the book also touches upon, as I was mentioning, the question of housing maintenance and also this kind of, let's say, constructive critique of bad governance, which I think is something that the book has been trying to tackle. There is one question by Dean Whiting, which you partially answered. Actually, there were two questions. So the first one, I think you answered by discussing the format of the studio and how the studio was in fact not a short-term studio. So for people who were not reading it, the question was how in the short time of a studio, advanced specific design work then engage all these issues. I mean, maybe just briefly to specify one of the strengths of this program, and that is really important, is that it spans almost 3 semesters, which makes it a very comprehensive and powerful time frame to really develop works. This said, all of this work were developed within 1 semester. So it means you are in a frame of an entire year, but you're working on 1 semester. I think it was always very targeted. I think Marc very well explained the kind of targets. I'm going to the second question.
Charlotte, you might have to add that the students we had were professionals. They already had a professional degree.
So it's a post-professional, yes.
Higher level. And then the work that I showed in the second part of my presentation was done by the faculty at my chair. Okay? I think this is very important, that it was taken then from the students and further developed by the research team.
Right. So the kind of, let's say, all the post-production and editing was done afterwards. So, but the design work was there, I would say. So Marc, I think that there's a good question from Dean Whiting again. It's a little bit of a provocation too. I can see the design work, but how did you get from 0 to 60, as we say, regarding policy intelligence to ensure that the projects were smart design-wise and policy-wise? It seems that the best projects focused on a single policy loophole or opportunity rather than trying to be comprehensive, no?
Well, yeah, what's interesting about the loophole is that it takes us back to the idea of the Trojan horse that you had proposed in 2008. So maybe you should address this as well. But what was interesting about this 1-year course, subdivided in three trimesters, is that we went to Marseille and we worked with local stakeholder. Okay, so our friend who joined us before was very much involved in the course and gave us a very quick entry into Marseille. And we went twice to the city. Is that correct, Charlotte? We went twice to the city.
Yes.
And this allowed us then to check also the various preliminary strategies then with people on the ground that knew more about Marseille than we did. But I think 0 to 60, that's the modus operandi.
But Marc, it's also perhaps useful to add that, so in the case of Marseille, I mean, being from there, it was also easier for me to kind of frame certain of the issues. So it's also fair to add that there is a certain level of local knowledge. But then I think that in the question of Sarah, there is also somehow the possibility to see how these single loopholes are potentially more powerful in terms of policy than a kind of absolute, kind of comprehensive top-down view, because that is not the kind of power that one or agency that one would be able to act upon, while creating a cooperative, for instance, is something that we've actually discussed with local inhabitants after the book was published, especially during the exhibition time. bringing up, for instance, all these kind of legal tools as a way to empower population. I mean, in the case of Noailles, we're talking about a block. We're not talking about an entire neighborhood, of course, but the existing examples of cooperatives or of let's say legal mechanisms that exist can actually be very powerful, I believe, even though one could consider them anecdotic because they are loopholes. So I actually would be quite hopeful with the use of such tools.
But what's interesting about the way you position yourself as an urban designer is, for example, your practice, you call it a strategic practice. And this is where I see your practical work reflected also in the work of the students, because you were always extremely strategic about each project, and you were trying to foreground a particular strategy, which you would later then summarize in the various principles that are shown in the book. There are two more questions. Why tilting the book, Migrant Marseille? I mean, it's because it's a flag, so this is why we tilted it. So this is a quick answer. And then Ole Fischer asks, wonderful, would you please elaborate about the aesthetic shown in the book, the black-white graphics of urban neighborhoods, demolitions, the post-digital images of the new designs, etc. So this is, I think, an extremely important question, because you need to be aware that for all the books that we are doing, or we were doing at the chair, and I showed only 5 of them, we worked with something fantastic from Berlin, and they were advising us on specific strategies, also connecting similar ways of depicting demolitions from one book to the other. So if you go to the book on Rio de Janeiro, on Città de Deus, you will find the same type of graphics, but then black denotes something else. And they were involved in teaching. They were also designing the exhibitions that we showed in Marseille, but they were also helping us, helping the students in how to present their work. So they were involved in the enterprise.
And maybe it's an interesting point that Ole is making, because there was last week a conference held by Jessie Le Cavalier, who is also a former member of the teams of Marc, about it was called Graphic Content Drawing as Method, and I think there was a lot of discussion that are pointed at or hidden in this question, which are related to the importance of representation and how you can make sure that you convey in a kind of let's say as approachable as possible some of the complexities of the work that has been done. And what was discussed, for instance, was that there is a kind of, let's say, rising prevalence of drawing. I think that all of us have seen that. You know how, for instance, for COVID, you can see in newspaper axonometric views of, spaces and how long you should stay in one space with how many people, or even the kind of Lego how you say, instruction leaflets or IKEA instruction leaflets, which have become very prevalent. So in a way, there is also an attempt to deal with this as a way to harness that kind of familiarity that is now with the drawing. Marc, I cannot resist, because there is a question about Le Corbusier, and you know that he's my favorite. He's my favorite kind of, how you say, shooting target. Okay, I'm going to pick it up and I make it very short.
Okay, so you're going to answer Martin Peto's question,
yes,
from Marseille, and I will address Enrica Manelli's question.
Exactly, perfect. We split it that way. So Martin Peto, thank you so much for allowing me to pick up on my favorite anti-hero. I know it might be off track, but where did Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation fit on the spectrum of housing in Marseille's life? I know it's situated in the south, but what was the original intention? Who was it designed for? So I will not dwell too much into the kind of history of l'Unité, because it's well known, and of course it was supposed to be replicated. So it's located in the south. It is featured in the book as in precedent to the grands ensembles, or to like the massive mass housing estates that are found all across the country. So it is actually, in a way, a precedent that has really, let's say, formed the imaginary and even the kind of desire for many architects who have then built estates in the northern side of the city to basically emulate. So you could see it as a model. I think that many architects are really still looking at it with envy, and it has, of course, in the meantime, become completely gentrified. It's housed mostly by architects, surprise, and it's been renovated. It's actually very beautiful. Problematic for many reasons. I will not dive too much into it, but it's kind of hostile to the very idea of urbanity because of its kind of insular nature, and the idea that you don't even have to leave the building anymore, something that has been repeated and tragically failed in the case of, for instance, Parc Calisté, where you would have that kind of those slabs, and then you have a supermarket, and then you have shops, and then if the shops and the supermarkets closed, you don't have anything, and you're very far from the center. So the kind of reliance on this equipment is, I think, one of the feature that speaks of the failure of this kind of urban forms.
That's
Marc,
a lot. You have to admit it's a fantastic building nonetheless.
I know. But I really hate the guy. What can I say?
Okay. We have been trained with Corbusier, so it's fine. Enrica Manelli writes, thank you very much for your presentation. What is the role of urban policies within the studio, and what is the relationship between design and urban policies? So I would like to address the relationship between urban design and urban policy after the studio. Okay, this is when we go back onto the sites and we re-establish a dialogue with local communities, so truly bottom up. And there are often policies within that register at the community level. And then the second level is the state level. And that's the most difficult one. Okay? This is where we really had to use all our connections within the various countries in order to reach these ministers. And you never knew how long they would remain in power. And we were very successful in Egypt regarding, collaborating with the Minister of Informal Settlements till her ministry was abolished. In Brazil, we were very, very successful with the Ministry of Housing till the point where suddenly there was a change of regimes, and Rousseff was not anymore in power. Somebody else came in, and then she had nothing to say anymore. So this was the more difficult one. The policy making at the level of the state, at the national level, was the most difficult one. And then the third level is I talked about connections to intergovernmental institutions. That was rather easy because they were speaking our language. They were interested in a certain degree of abstraction. And in all those cases, we used urban design as the platform to discuss potential changes in policy. And Charlotte, maybe you could address how it entered the studio.
How policy could enter the studio?
Yeah, how did it?
I mean, I think it's.
I talked about post-studio.
Yeah, no, I think that urban policies are always, were always part of the studio in the sense that the kind of entry point into the site always paid a lot of attention to how, what are the mechanisms, what are the social, political, and economic mechanisms behind the production of space, and trying to understand why the situations were the way they are. And I think that it was very successful, for instance, in Egypt, to also have an insight on urban policies, understanding the kind of contempt of the state vis-a-vis self-built urbanization. And it's interesting, Marc, you were mentioning how the states, the Egyptian state is still kind of ignoring this. It's not the case anymore, because there is suddenly somebody has realized that this is a kind of financial tax, untapped resource, and now the state has started to basically implement a kind of racket scheme. How would you say, like a scheme where if you want your house to be legalized, you need to pay a fine based on the amount of stories that you have. So there is a kind of new acknowledgement of the existence of this settlement without providing the public services that would be, coming with the recognition.
Yeah, they tried before. They tried before under the Mubarak regime, because they realized, and this was the model, the De Soto model, was advising the Mubarak regime, and they saw, they saw these informal settlements as a source of income for taxes, but it never worked.
Yeah, it's being retried, let's say. So yeah, but just to say that urban policy has always been something that that is kind of a, I mean, at the core of the understanding of what this urban design studio was, meaning, whatever is design is never an object. It's always part, entrenched, deeply connected to all the kind of actors, forces, and regulations that are in place, even, working with the ideas that you go around those, and that you can rewrite some policy, that you can circumvent some of them in order to propose kind of like strategic urban design schemes. So very important part.
One more question, Charlotte.
Yes. Yes.
Might be able to answer. That's Manon Jones' questions. Could you please elaborate on why the municipality is so reluctant to engage citizens in planning processes around public space and housing? And this could be maybe our last question.
This would be a question that Nicola would answer in a splendid way. He talks about contempt. And I think that, I don't know if this is a French malady specifically. I think it's unfortunately something that you can witness in many other contexts. There is in France, at least, there is a contempt for participation. There is a certain contempt for populations, and the idea that it's probably coming from a kind of techno-positivist engineer mentality. The country is ruled by engineers and let's say grands fonctionnaires, people who have been educated in École Polytechnique or l'ENA, École Nationale de l'Administration, grandes écoles as they are called, tall schools. I don't know how you can translate that, but they produce the elite of the nation, which are then kind of re-injected on the territory, and basically are entitled with this kind of engineering like mentality, very much let's say disdainful of citizens, of everyday people. So this is something that percolates, of course, at all level of governance. You can see it at presidential level. I don't think that the current president has shown a very deep street intelligence, as we have seen with the Gilets jaunes crisis. This percolates at the level of the municipality, where you can see the former municipality, for instance, which was ruling 25 years with really a very strong hold on all matters social, that led to the current situation, which is very difficult, was never really interested in listening to what people vote, and not even kind of going in the direction of dialogue. It was actually made, everything is made at the opposite. It's very difficult to vote. People have lost interest. So you have basically the voting south that votes for the conservative municipality, and the non-voting north that actually has lost any interest in the, let's say, or a lot of interest into the democratic system, because it doesn't represent them. And that also answer maybe to this question related to the reluctance of engaging citizens. So there is one last point. The new municipality has actually initiated, so it's a left-inclined municipality, has initiated consultative and participative processes to deal with the city center's issue. So there is some kind of hope However, as Nicola was mentioning, the prerogatives of the city have been stripped away and given to the regional entity, the métropole, which is right inclined. So you have a kind of conflict in governance, which makes it very difficult to actually do anything. So that was quite a long answer on that. Marc, there are two questions, maybe one for you about the graduates of the MAS, and then the last one about Marseille's colonial past, and I think we can close with that.
Great. I thought you had answered the colonial past in your presentation, but so Lorena Quintana asks, do you have any clues as how the graduates of the studio pursue what they pursue after their academic experience when they return into practice? So this is quite interesting because they were professionals, then they come and work on this experiment for 1 year, and then they either continue with other studies, which has happened, and others return to practice and to their countries. And we encourage them to return to their countries because they are coming from all over the world. And what's interesting is to see how their approach to urban design has been altered through the debates and discussions that they had with us, and I can guarantee you we had an impact on whatever they are doing.
I'm also a graduate of the MIS myself.
Yeah, but you're an extreme case.
Okay. So the last question about the housing disparities, yeah, very quickly. I think I mentioned it earlier. Marc was saying the kind of industrial past and the fact that let's say the labor, the migrant labor, which was sourced from French colonies, were basically not receiving any housing. They basically clustered around the existing industry, and then the kind of let's say urban development that came with the industry didn't favor, of course, the kind of mixity in terms of social income in that area. So you have a kind of dichotomy. That dichotomy is highly, kind of so deeply ingrained today. For instance, there is a discrepancy between the access to swimming pools if you're in the north or if you're in the south. If you're in the south, it's like, I don't know how many cubic meter, but it's infinitesimal compared to the south. So the kind of, let's say, equality of access to equipment is much less in the north than in the south. The public transport is, indigent in the north, doubled in the south. And then the kind of, grands ensembles, decaying housing projects are overwhelmingly positioned in the north as well as they were, where the kind of land availabilities which were related to industries were free, and that kind of perpetrated the kind of situation. So the colonial situation, I think, is more to be read into these kind of waves of migration than just in looking at how one-to-one the economy of the colonies were kind of related to that. They were related to matière première, to the kind of injection of goods and of people into the city.
In order to overcome this apartheid, okay, we need to increase the amount of white on the French flag.
Yeah, let's do that. You can run for president, Marc.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for this great evening, and thank you for the audience. I see that there were quite a huge amount of people, and thank you for everyone who asked questions. If you are interested, please have a look at the book, and maybe you will find some of the answers. And yeah, thank you very much. And again, see you perhaps around. I know that we have announced the other events of the GSD, so please have a look at the website to follow up on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye, Marc.